Can you flesh out the thinking and kind of evolution of the Bund's critique of Zionism?
Well, the Bund and Zionists, they hated each other from the start. And while that particular resolution doesn't use socialist language, the Bund always had a socialist critique of Zionism. In
Yeah.
1903, Bundists called Zionism the most evil enemy of the organized Jewish proletariat.
Wow.
And there, and Chaim Weizmann that same year said that everywhere our hardest struggle is conducted against the Jewish labor Bund. So this is a
Wow.
long-standing beef. And the Bund actually banned Zionists from membership in 1901, I believe, with the resolution you cited.
Right.
So there were a few things. First of all, as Josh says, they viewed Zionism as utopian. I would say that they like viewed it as the product of people smoking the good drugs. They were like, you're going to take millions of Jews and you're going to have them go to the Levant and work on collective farms. Yeah, sure you are. They almost felt like this idea was so Looney Tunes that it was a plot by Jewish bosses to distract from the fact that they were paying their Jewish workers starvation wages by, endowing a yeshiva in Palestine. The same sort of laundering of rich people's reputations via philanthropy that we see so often today. But another thing that's really important is that the Bund felt that Zionism was an acquiescence to the same bigots that wanted Jews to leave Europe. And there's a line that I'm quoting this from memory, so I'm it, if I butcher a word, Josh, forgive. But it's in my book where I think it's around maybe 1901, where a local Bund committee says, we are not strangers here and not guests, even though the Russian government considers us as such. Um, the land is soaked through with our blood, and we will stay and we will fight for that which belongs to us, for our human, civil, and political rights. And so there's this real
Mm.
ethos where the Bund feels like Zionism is giving in to their tormentors. Now, as Zionism gets the backing of the British Empire through the Balfour Declaration, the Bundist opposition to it takes on different dimensions. They also view it as a huge waste of resources. The Jewish community of Poland is exponentially larger than the Yishuv in Palestine. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but in 19 in 1920, it's what is it, like 10 times as large? It's much, much larger.
Yes, yes.
And you have Vladimir Medem that year writing about um, Jews in Warsaw fainting of hunger beneath
Mm.
banners for the Zionist movement that are screaming in quote like fat black screaming letters. That's what he calls it. Give money to the Jews of Palestine. And he even dismisses the Yishuv as a community small enough to be accommodated by a Warsaw poorhouse. But, and this is something I think that's really important. I really think that this has been downplayed in Bundist historiography. The Bund were socialists, and as socialists, they believed in human equality. And from the very start, they had a critique of Zionism that was based on the fact that Zionism has always entailed the land grabs and the expulsions of Palestinians. And there's this really amazing book that I can't quote from it because it's not out yet, but it's going to be published by Haymarket in 2027. That's entirely translations of Bundist writing on the Palestinians.
Really?
And
That's amazing.
it's really, really amazing. And there's an article by Baruch Shefner, for instance, who's a Polish Bundist, where he talks about how the Zionist movement literally calls the Bundists Arabs. And I found this too when I was looking through Neue Volkszeitung, the Bund, and
Mhm.
Heint, which is the Yiddish Zionist daily in Warsaw. They called them Arabs. And that was both because the Bund covered, Palestine National Congress, they covered the Palestinian movement, but also because the Bundists were enemies of the Zionists, and the Zionist movement used the term Arab as a slur a lot. And in Baruch Shefner's article, he ends it by saying, "We are proudly the Arabs of Warsaw." The Bundist movement were ferocious critics of nationalism, of all nationalism, whether it was by the oppressed or by the oppressor.
But
Um,
Molly, just let me stop it. I just help me understand how they were ferocious critiques of nationalism, and yet Josh had told us at the beginning
Exactly.
of the
Yeah.
conversation that they're basically split with the communists is partly about their insistence that Jews are a nation who deserve national
Exactly.
yeah.
autonomy.
So
And by
okay.
the way,
So
those Russians called the Bundists nationalists,
yes,
meaning
yes.
Right,
They
that
right,
was their stinging critique that they're
right,
actually
right.
no different than Zionists.
Right.
and they're promoting a lost cause.
Right.
No,
So let me
no, it's
help
totally
Molly
true.
with it.
Chauvinism.
So
Yeah.
Chauvinism is what
Yeah.
they said.
yeah.
Go ahead, Molly. Go ahead,
So
Molly.
first of all, Plechon, like I don't feel like the critiques of the Bolshevik faction of the RSDLP were necessarily always in the good faith.
Mhm, mhm,
Um, it's actually quite easy to see how people could believe in multiculturalism, believe in pride in
mhm,
your ethnic group, believe in the promotion of your language, your culture, your
mhm.
cultural institutions, without thinking you needed to fucking carve a border in blood. This is actually something that we see as a lived reality every day in New York City. And when
Mhm.
the Bund was talking about nationalism, and I want to be very explicit, when I say that the Bund opposed nationalism,
Mhm.
they said that over and over and over again. And you have people like Henrik Ehrlich, Chmurner in Poland, saying that equating nationalism and chauvinism and saying dead up, we oppose all
Right,
nationalism, including Jewish
right,
nationalism. You have a
right.
line by Henrik Ehrlich where he says, if our nationalism is less bloodthirsty than the nationalism of other nations, it's only because we lack the power to be. So they
Mm,
opposed the idea that you should take bits of land and draw borders around them and make them into ethnostates, which was the idea that was so dominant in interwar
right,
Europe. And it was an idea that they very much suffered from themselves because
right,
Poland in the interwar period was a violently nationalist place that huge swaths of Polish society viewed Jews as essentially aliens that should be expelled from the Polish nation. And in Zionism, Bundists saw a mirror image of the violent, bigoted ethno-nationalism of Eastern
right,
Europe that they themselves had suffered
right.
from so
And then, Molly,
much.
can I ask you on
Yeah.
this? I was really struck by this passage in your book. In 1929, there was this massacre of Jews uh, um,
Hebron
in
and Safed.
in Hebron. Excuse me. In right, it was a terrible incident. I think over 60 Jews were killed in Hebron, and there was a demonstration in Warsaw by various. But the Bund refused to take part, and they were hotly criticized. But you quote them saying, "We are opposed." If I'm right, we are opposed to chauvinism and nationalism in any form. So we
Yes.
can't walk with the Zionists. And in this case, it was revisionist Zionists. This was Vladimir Jabotinsky. But I was struck by that thing, that little difficult, thread to get through, where you're for national rights for the Jews, but you're opposed to nationalism. Can you describe that moment, how the Bund reacted
Yes.
to
So,
this demonstration?
so in 1929, as I'm sure like many of the listeners know, there were horrific riots in Palestine, where over 100 Jews and over 100 Palestinians as well were killed. But particularly in Hebron, there were horrific massacres of the longstanding Sephardic community, and also of young Lithuanian yeshiva students.
Right,
And
right.
these massacres were covered in the international press, and it became a massive cause of mourning for Jewish communities around the world, including in Poland. And the Bund refused to participate in the demonstrations of mourning, which were not just revisionist demonstrations. I want to make clear these were
Mhm.
general Jewish communal demonstrations. And the reason was that even as they, of course, saw the horror of these massacres, they blamed them on Zionism for working with the
Oh,
British to take away the political rights and land of Palestinians. And instead of participating in the morning demonstrations, they had a 3,000 person rally at Warsaw's Splendid Theater under the banner of Liquidate Zionism, where they talk about how the Zionists are exploiting the victims. And they have a line, which again, I'm going to quote from memory here, so please forgive any errors. But the answer to more tragically but pointlessly spilled blood was not in national chauvinism, but in international solidarity and the growth of the socialist
mm,
movement. And this was not one demonstration they had. They then went on a lecture tour around Poland. They published a book by Yosef Chmurner called "What Can the Events in Palestine Teach Us?" which is I mean, it's a brutal evisceration of Zionism, and not just Jabotinsky's revisionist Zionism, but also Poale Zion, which was the leftist Zionist movement. They sent a delegate to America to talk about why they would not participate in these demonstrations of mourning. And obviously, this was a complete scandal in the Jewish world. And I read Heint, which was the, mainstream Yiddish Zionist newspaper in Warsaw, and they are denouncing the Bund and for this, and not just denouncing them, but they're trying to organize to strip funding from the Bundist-dominated Siko school system in interwar Poland because they're so scandalized by this. And I even found in Neue Volkszeitung, the Bund's newspaper, reports of a Bundist councilman in Vilna being beaten by Zionists with baseball bats.